field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. Young people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children, what's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner with the Robust Opposition, and I am pleased to present my guest, Dave Dayen, who is, the executive editor of the American Prospect. How you doing tonight, Dave?
Good, Lauren. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, I've had you on before, and you're one of my favorite progressive journalists, and I just want my viewers to know that I contribute to the American Prospect, and I encourage all you viewers to do the same, because Dave is really unbought, so you can really trust everything that he says, but he isn't so biased that he tries to put everything into a specific narrative. And that's what we're getting to tonight in my show about Biden's economic picks, because they really are a mixed bag. And so I want to talk about which ones are good, which ones are bad, which ones are just okay. But first, I wanted to just have an overall comment and have you address it. Ryan Grimm, who's another great progressive journalist who I've had on my show and whose opinion I trust, wrote in his Substack yesterday that, and he went through all these people that we're going to discuss, that Biden's economic policy picks are much more progressive than Obama's. And you wrote in your article, quote, Biden's centrist proclivities are more hemmed in when the policy center of the Democratic Party has changed, unquote. So we all know that Biden is no Bernie Sanders, far from it. But can you speak to how you think the times and progressive activists may have affected his choices?
Yeah, absolutely. Elections have consequences. We knew that this wasn't going to look like Bernie Sanders' cabinet. It wasn't going to look like Elizabeth Warren's cabinet or anybody's. It's going to be Joe Biden's cabinet, and we know what that means. And that's generally playing out. You have to think about this in absolute and relative terms. So in relative terms, I do agree with Ryan that compared to the Obama cabinet in 2008, which was actually chosen before he even got elected by Michael Froman, who was a Citigroup executive at the time, who wrote in something we know from WikiLeaks, wrote a document to John Podesta saying, here's the guys that we should have for the cabinet, and they almost all came true. So that's not the situation this time around. If you look on just line them up person to person, I think the ball has been moved a little bit to the left, and I think it's consistent with the areas where progressives have really won the conversation, right? So progressives have won the conversation around the minimum wage. House Democrats passed a $15 an hour minimum wage this year. So what do we get in Biden's cabinet? We get a lot of labor economists. People like Jared Bernstein, who's been talking about wages and full employment forever. Heather Boucher, Janet Yellen, who's a longtime labor economist. Progressives have won the conversation around education. Charter schools are not something that you hear about a lot in the Democratic Party anymore, at the high levels anyway. Under Obama, there was a charter advocate, Arne Duncan, who became the education secretary. This time around, we're probably going to see a public school teacher become education secretary. Likely Lily Escalon Garcia is the head of the NEA, so a union leader. Progressives have won the conversation around, to a degree, not completely, but to a degree, around corporate power, around antitrust and big tech. And I did a story about a week ago about how Silicon Valley tried to get a tech lawyer who actually prepped Jeff Bezos for the big congressional hearings on antitrust with with Amazon and Facebook and Google. They wanted to get her to be the head of the antitrust division, and the Biden team said no. We're not going to do that. So, sometimes it's not who gets in, but who didn't get in, right?
Yeah.
So you put those things together, and I think in those areas, you do see Biden wanting to be in the center, wanting to kind of please all groups, and shifting to the left where the party has shifted to the left, where the party sort of has neglected that and remains entrenched in the center right or the center. You're seeing kind of a same old. I mean, the thing about Biden is he does seem to prefer expertise. And if you prefer expertise and you want people who have the experience to do the kinds of jobs that you do in the federal government, you're going to go back to the last administration, which is the Obama administration. Or maybe you go back to the previous one before that, which is the Clinton administration. And so there's, if that's what you value as expertise, you're going to get a lot of Clinton and Obama retreads. And, that doesn't necessarily have to be bad, but it can be pretty bad. And sometimes it is.
Can you talk about the second part of my question, which is how much you think progressive activists may have affected him? Because a lot of us progressives, including me, who did not vote for him, said the time to influence him would be before we gave him our endorsements and our votes, not after. And we've been seeing a lot of people using words like betrayed or disappointed or baffled by some of his picks. But with the economic picks, which I've called this show a mixed bag, I think there's some good ones. How much do you think progressive activists were able to affect him? Or do you think it's more just the kind of times that we're in?
I mean, I think it's one of the, it's a mix of both. The reason that the Democratic Party has shifted in some areas is because of progressive activism on the ground, right? I mean, the fight for 15 is what brought Democrats further along on the minimum wage. The antitrust movement is a ground, in many ways, a ground-based movement. Education, you look at the teacher strikes that were around the country a couple of years ago, I think that really galvanized and changed the way that Democrats think about education. So I would say that this shift in policy orientation is largely, part and parcel with the progressive left. Now, there is, a group of progressives that have been really focused on personnel and setting up possible nominees and talking about people they don't want to see. And that's been, to use your phrase, a mixed bag. I mean, some of it has been, the choices have been better than the alternatives, but they have not necessarily been the ones that progressives, desperately sought for those particular positions. So, Biden's kind of middle of the road, and that shouldn't really surprise anybody.
Okay, now let's talk about Janet Yellen, who is his choice to be the Treasury Secretary. She was Obama's Federal Reserve head. And talk about her background as a labor economist and as a Fed chair, and say why so many progressives are happy with her.
Sure. I mean, this has been her research throughout her career. Is how to increase wages, how to use various fiscal policy or monetary policy to assist people in the labor market. And she has been kind of early on the subject of inequality, someone who talked about that pretty consciously while she was Fed chair, and even before that, as she was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under Clinton. She's actually held every major economic policymaking role in the government. Certainly the first woman to ever be CEA chair, Fed chair, and Treasury secretary. So, she brings a lot of credibility, and what she doesn't bring is a lot of baggage. So she never worked on Wall Street. She doesn't have those ties to the sort of Robert Rubin school of policymaking in the Democratic Party. She has been, she's set up in Berkeley. She was an economist at UC Berkeley, which is home to, all of the people who are writing about inequality today: Gabrielle Zuckman, Emmanuel Saez, all of those economists. That's the school in which she comes out of, Robert Reich as well. So, I think there's a lot to recommend there. It'll be interesting to see how she uses this position, which is different than the Fed. The Fed is concerned about interest rates and monetary policy. She kind of deferred on financial regulation to staff at the Fed, I feel, whereas the Treasury Secretary is an important financial regulator. It has the power of being, in control of the IRS. And can do a lot on tax policy. We haven't seen really Janet Yellen talk a lot about tax policy and how that can improve people's after-tax income. And of course, now where we are in the pandemic, she's going to have an opportunity to put together a fiscal plan. In the last decade or so, Treasury secretaries have really been the key economic policymakers. I mean, Tim Geithner was the economic policymaker in the Obama administration first term. Steve Mnuchin, to a large degree, has been the economic policymaker in the Trump administration. The tax bill is basically his bill. And so Yellen's going to have that opportunity. And on those terms, compared to the alternatives, I think it was a decent enough choice.
Yes. Now, I heard her yesterday. There was a long profile of her. I think it was on the Daily on NPR that I was listening to. And they played an excerpt of her bringing up on the floor of Congress inequality. And she was dressed down by a Republican congressman, I forget his name, saying the Fed should not be talking about that. So it's really good that she's now going to be in a position as Treasury Secretary where she could deal with fiscal policy and not monetary policy. But in terms of monetary policy, she was known for gradually raising the interest rates, which is what enabled me to finally get 2% return on a Treasury bill and CDs, which I actually thought was good. Forgetting about 10 years ago, I could get 7 to 10% return on those vehicles. But we know that this is why the stock market is so goosed up, because the Fed has been lowering, under Trump, lowering the interest rates back down to zero practically. So there's nowhere else for people to go to put their money, if anybody even has any money. And just yesterday, she came out publicly saying that we must have a significant stimulus legislation. So what kind of role will she have now that she's no longer with the Fed? Is there any coordination with the Fed in terms of monetary policy? We'll talk more about monetary policy when we get to Brian Dees and what BlackRock has done, but what can she do in addition to what she can do with stimulus as far as the Fed?
Well, there's definitely coordination between Treasury and the Fed, not necessarily on monetary policy, but right now, we're seeing this argument between Treasury and the Fed because you had these credit facilities that were created under the CARES Act, and Mnuchin asked for the money back from Jerome Powell, even though there's still obviously economic trouble on the horizon. So Yellen on day one could restart those credit programs and return that deposit base to the Fed so they can continue with those facilities. And, while I have no real interest in continuing to have the Fed buy corporate debt, I don't see the point behind that. And that just really serves to prop up asset prices. There are some other credit facilities that could help state and local governments, for example, who desperately need the help, or smaller businesses. So it'll be interesting to see what Yellen does around that and how she coordinates with Jerome Powell, who was a Fed governor when she was the chair. So they obviously have a relationship. So on the rest, I mean, she's going to have the ability to craft a significant stimulus. The question is, will Mitch McConnell allow it to be voted on? I mean, that's the big thing in all of this is, she's only going to be as successful as the Senate allows. And the Senate control is up in the air right now. Will depend on Georgia in January.
Yeah, it's so funny. I just tweeted at a progressive friend of mine who is one of these black and white thinkers where they look for things to fit the narrative. And so there was I don't know if it was Politico or whatever, it was a headline that said, Biden seeks to not embarrass, McConnell with the stimulus program. And this guy wrote, like, what the actual F word, And I wrote back, well, what do you want him to do? I mean, this guy is actually more powerful than Biden right now. Do you want him to alienate the guy who's in charge of passing this thing? It's like, I can't even believe that I find myself defending Biden. But I mean, let's be real here. Let's talk about the Deputy Treasury Secretary nominee, which is a guy by the name of Adewale Adeyemo. People were concerned that he did a 2-year stint at BlackRock, which we're going to talk about more later when we get to Brian Dees, the really awful appointee. But Adeyemo has other experience and background that made at least your colleague, Robert Kuttner, speak favorably about him. Can you speak to him?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm quite where Bob is yet on Adeyemo, but he was chief of staff under Elizabeth Warren at the CFPB right when it first started in 2010. He's a guy who's from Los Angeles, actually, LA area, who grew up pretty poor, worked his way through school, was only about 29 when he was chief of staff of CFPB. So very, able to move very swiftly through the ranks of accomplishment. And is someone that, according to my sources, gets along very well with everybody, all factions of the Democratic Party. I might be even more concerned that he spent the most recent last 2 years as head of the Obama Foundation, which is really just a fundraising job. I mean, that's just a job where you try to get money from rich people. So I'm worried that sort of colors his perspective as much as anything. There are certainly people who vouch for him, people who, I respect to a certain degree, who definitely say he's someone who gets along with everyone. He is a hard worker. I think it's pretty clear that Yellen has the authority to say this is what I say goes at the Treasury Department. Hopefully she will use that authority. So I'm not totally sold on Adeyemo, but I also don't know that he's going to have a major policymaking role.
Okay, so let's move over to the Council for Economic Advisors, who his nominee to head that is Cecilia Rouse. And she is a Princeton economist who specializes in education economics. I started to look into some of her work and it was so dry. It's about statistics. She was writing about, the benefit of 2-year colleges or vouchers, and I couldn't make head or tails of what her opinions were. She just seems so like mathematical. I don't even know what her philosophy is, but she is a labor economist and people are praising her. And then there's 2 others, Jared Bernstein, who we know was Biden's economics advisor as vice president, and Heather Bushey, and both of them are also labor economists. So people are speaking very favorably about those 3. What do you think of them? And do you think that they will be on the whole progressive?
I think CA, those picks are generally pretty good. I think Jared Bernstein, who I know quite well, he was sort of the token progressive in the Obama administration as Vice President Biden's chief economist. I think he probably would have gotten the chair of this council if his health was better. He had a pretty serious health scare last year. And so, but he's able to do this job, and he's really solid, someone who's written, extensively about full employment and the importance of it. He understands power relationships, the importance of unions. The importance of trade policy, I think he's going to be really strong on that. He's written quite extensively for The Prospect in the past, including a really good article about progressive trade policy in 2016, which you can check out. So I think
before you leave that, I just want to interject about the TPP, because I've read that Biden wants to rejoin the TPP, and I think I was very, very active in fighting that. And one of the good things I thought Trump did was he killed the TPP. But of course, they have a new one now. I think it's called the REPC or RPEC.
RECP, yeah.
This big, much bigger trade bloc that was started by China that we're not even in. And they say that, the new NAFTA is a little bit better because it doesn't have that investor state dispute resolution clause that everybody hated. And Janet Yellen is also making noises about getting more involved with multilateral agreements. So what is your position on where Biden is going to be on trade relative to where Obama was?
I think the key is who gets that trade representative position and what it means. There's a shot that Gary Gensler, who's a very, he kind of was an apostate Goldman Sachs guy who came out of Goldman Sachs, got into the Obama administration, and then became this real progressive guy on financial regulation. So much so that Obama threw him out in the second term. He didn't want any part of him anymore. Gensler wants to be trade rep. And I think if he gets it, I think you're going to see some different orientation. If you see someone like a Jimmy Gomez, who's been sort of whispered about, he's a congressman from Los Angeles, then what it really means is that the trade rep is not going to be involved in trade policy. He's just going to be a functionary, and it'll be run out of the White House, and particularly out of the National Economic Council and Brian Deese, who we'll talk about later. And that would be troubling. In Jared Bernstein, you certainly have somebody who would not be for rejoining the TPP, who would not be for the same old in trade policy. So, you got to hope that Biden listens to him. I think it would be catastrophic to return to the old guard of trade policy. And by the way, it wasn't anyone. The people who torched TPP was not Trump, and it was not the Republicans. It was the Democrats. There weren't enough Democratic votes for the TPP when Obama was in office to pass that. So there would have been enough if there was the free trade Republicans and enough Democrats, but there weren't enough Democrats. So I think if he tries that again, he will get a swift hearing about that from progressives in Congress.
Yes, I might have to jump back into action. I don't know if you know, but I was the one who organized the TPP protest on the floor of the 2016 Democratic Convention, and they tried.
I think it would be a big mistake.
Yeah,
we'll see.
So getting to Brian Deese and the National Economic Council, I think it was you who wrote that they actually that council was put in there into the White House to sort of act as a buffer or a filter or the gatekeeper for the Council for Economic Advisors. And if that's the case, it makes him the one who is going to get Biden's ear more than these three progressives that we just spoke about. And there's so much bad about Brian Deese. Before we get to the climate stuff, which you've written about, you wrote a whole article on him. Let's talk about his role in BlackRock. And first, let people know what BlackRock is again, and their specific role, you alluded to it before, in being, the corporate debt and what the Fed did in terms of buying the corporate debt, which is responsible for the fact that the stock market is at record highs when so many people, more people since the Great Depression, are actually going to food banks.
Yeah. So first of all, just to pick up on your point, so the National Economic Council is pretty new. It was invented in 1993, and we know who became president in 1993. That was Bill Clinton. And the first head of the National Economic Council was Robert Rubin. Yeah. So this was a position that was created specifically for Robert Rubin to circumvent the independent advice that the president was supposed to be getting on economic policy from the CEA, from the Council of Economic Advisors. It was to centralize economic policymaking within the White House. And that was the goal of this position. So Robert Rubin held it. You get to Obama, and the first NEC director is Larry Summers. So that's what this position is. It's a gatekeeper coordinating position where, and it's one of the most important positions that nobody knows about.
Yeah.
And so yes, I agree with you that NEC is more important than CEA. And so that's why it is so troubling that Brian Deese, who has not been formally named, it's been said in the media that he's going to be the choice, but he has not actually been formally named yet. It is troubling that he would be part of this. So talk about BlackRock. BlackRock is the world's largest asset management company. What that means is that they're, people put their money with BlackRock and in BlackRock funds and get them invested. A lot of them are index funds where they buy the entire market. A lot of them are more specialized funds. BlackRock also runs a platform where other companies can trade. So it's not only involved in the trillions of dollars of assets it has under management, but also it has a role to play in a bunch of other people's assets under management because of this this platform that for trading that it created. It is so powerful that the Fed, when it wanted to buy this corporate debt, they hired BlackRock to do it for them because they didn't, that BlackRock literally had more expertise than the Federal Reserve in dealing with this. And very predictably, the purchases of corporate debt have been disproportionately weighted towards BlackRock funds. So they're literally buying from themselves. They're the buyer and the seller.
So if he does this, this is exactly what Trump said he was going to do, drain the swamp, but then he put the swamp in charge of the very regulatory agencies.
Right.
And
So I mean,
again, a fox guarding the hen house.
Well, let's talk about what Deese did at BlackRock. So, he was in the Obama administration. He was a climate advisor. Before that, he worked as a deputy at the NEC. And he goes to BlackRock as their global head of sustainability. So if you hear him tell it, he's like, I'm the guy that went to a big company to try to reform it, right? I tried to make them more green. That would be his take on it. Well, what he actually did, from what I hear from the activists and the people that were trying to push BlackRock in a certain direction, is that he made excuses for BlackRock's continued achievements in fossil fuels. So BlackRock owns more fossil fuel investments than any company in the world. It's been majorly involved in the deforestation of the Amazon. It has significant investments in oil, gas, coal, and every pronouncement that is made under Deese that trying to green itself has been ultimately empty and double talk and not as advertised. Yeah. Deese himself, when he was climate advisor, promoted Obama's all of the above energy strategy, promoted Arctic drilling, promoted fracking, was not sort of an advocate of weaning ourselves off fossil fuels, but talking about bridge fuels and safe. As long as we can do drilling safely, we can do it. So I have as much a problem with the policy making that we know that he defended as what he tried to do and failed to do at BlackRock. But certainly being in that milieu, being on Wall Street, BlackRock has a lot of things they want out of the US government and every government. It's very troubling if you look at their record around the world of the revolving door between BlackRock and government globally is quite stunning. Dozens of people who have gone between government positions and BlackRock. That's true in the United States, but it's also very true around the world. And this is the new vampire squid. This is the new Goldman Sachs. Yeah. And so it's extremely troubling to have Brian Deese in such an important position.
So do you think that the Sunrise Movement and Justice Democrats and Our Revolution and all the progressive groups that are banding together to try to stop this nomination might have any success?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, the one thing I hold on to is the fact that he has not been formally chosen, right? You know, there's a parallel in the foreign policy space where Biden announced all his foreign policy picks, but the Secretary of Defense wasn't in there. And everyone thought this woman, Michelle Flournoy, was going to become Secretary of Defense, but it hasn't been formally announced. And that signals to me that there's some wavering there and that they're worried about pushback from progressives. And the same thing, the same dynamic could be in play on Brian Deese. I mean, all of these other choices were made at CA and Treasury Secretary and the deputy and, you know, a lot of names. And yet NEC is still open. And so, you know, there's certainly a possibility that that something changes, although, you know, several outlets have reported that Deese is the guy. But, you know, maybe I'm holding out false hope, but I haven't seen Biden say it yet.
Yeah, I did my last show on his foreign policy picks, and we went over Michelle Flournoy in great detail. Let's get to the most, you know, one of the things that has been said by all the commentary in the mainstream corporate media about his picks is that they're very experienced and they're non-controversial, so that they would be likely to get confirmed. With the one exception of Neera Tanden,
Right.
who I think is hated by the right and by the extreme left. It's funny because the liberal media, they say that progressives like her, but I think they're really talking about liberals liking her because progressives can't stand Neera Tanden.
Right.
And what I wanted to ask you about is, do you think it has to do with her actual record so much as it does to the fact that she really was terrible to Bernie Sanders, both on social media and on cable news shows, and was also pretty terrible to Bernie Sanders supporters?
I mean, she's certainly been a lightning rod on social media about Sanders. And she was also a lightning rod about Republicans. And that's why the Senate Republicans have said that there's no chance in hell that she'd be not confirmed.
Yeah.
So, you know, she does not have the ideal posture for someone who might want to get confirmed by the Senate. You know, she was nominated to the Office of Management and Budget, and the committee that would then do the confirmation hearings would be the Budget Committee. And if Democrats win those 2 seats in Georgia, the chair of the Budget Committee would be a guy named Bernie Sanders. You know, so he would be holding this hearing. And, you know, Bernie, during the campaign this time around, called out Neera by name in a letter saying that she's belligerent and that she, you know, is harassing supporters and things like that. So that would be pretty fascinating. Even if he's just the ranking member, it'll be pretty fascinating to see how he reacts. You know, Tanden is certainly a lightning rod, as I said. This is another case where it's like probably better than the alternative, as weird as that might sound. You know, Bruce Reed was a guy who we thought was going to get this position, and he was the executive director of the Bowles-Simpson Commission. He's written books with Rahm Emanuel. He was the head and a key policymaker at the DLC, which is the Democratic Leadership Council, which has been the Wall Street Democrat kind of bastion for the last 30 years. Bruce Reed would be a much worse pick, I think, than Neera Tanden. That doesn't say much about Neera Tanden. That says a lot about Bruce Reed. And so, you know, I don't know that she's going to be confirmable, though. Yeah. And that brings into play, you know, whoever else it is that they have sitting in reserve.
Well, I wanted to ask you about this Twitter thread on her by a DSA member by the name of Dr. Stephen Thrasher that I thought was really interesting. He said that the Tanden pick was what was the final straw for him to leave the Democratic Party. That's how bad he thinks she is. But he really talks about her based on her practices. And he did an 18 part Twitter thread, which I will post in the comments. I won't read the whole thing, but I just want to read a couple of things where he writes, I hold research journalism, community, and government dear. I don't believe they should be fused with lobbying, strategy, marketing, or propaganda. And I don't think someone who has fused these sectors of society that should be independent should oversee the budget of the United States. In Chomsky Herman's propaganda model, there are 5 filters of mass media: ownership, advertising, sourcing, flack, anti-communism, and fear. At CAP, Tandem would take money from the owners of society, take money from work with advertisers, be a source herself on MSNBC and quoted endlessly in papers. Then she would also be the flack sent out to beat up people who got out of line. When it comes to the 5th filter, communism or fear, Tandon has been very successful at creating fear of a common enemy, Russia, but also of trying to scare everyone into the idea that there is no money for social programs, entitlements must be cut, etc.
Yeah.
What is your assessment of his assessment?
Well, I mean, you know, there's certainly a lot to say about the Center for American Progress and how she ran that. She certainly brought in a lot of good people, but also, you know, there's a lot of money sloshing around there from foreign governments. You know, there certainly were some practices that were unsavory. She took out a section of a paper that CAP did about, I think it was about gun violence, that was negative towards Bloomberg because Bloomberg gave them a big gift. She reportedly either shoved or hit a staff member because that staff member had the temerity of questioning Hillary Clinton about her vote in Iraq. So, I mean, there are a lot of things about Neera and how she ran CAP that I think are pretty troubling. And, you know, you know, if she actually gets this position, which I think is a very open question, I'm not sure she's going to get it at all. Yeah. There's a question about management. I mean, the OMB is a very important position. It's a very critical. It's not just the White House budget director where it sets the policy that sort of the budget standard that the White House goes off and then coordinates with agencies in terms of their funding and their appropriations, but it also it has a coordinating function on regulations. So all regulations from the federal government go to OMB and they do a sort of cost benefit analysis. They do a review, like a White House review of those regulations before they go out. And that has become a key choke point, especially in Democratic administrations, where the agencies usually want to do some regulating. That's become a key choke point, where regulations get delayed or regulations get denied because of OMB. So that I'm even more concerned about than the budgetary stuff. I think that she has, expressed some views on, similar to Bernstein and others on full employment that are actually decent. She's also has, situations around, entitlements and stuff in her past, and a very strange WikiLeaks thread where she said that we should take the oil of Libya or something. So there's a lot to read here. There's a lot going on with Neera, and she seems to covet drama and create a lot of it herself, which I don't think is a good quality in government officials, by the way.
Why do you think he chose her? Who do you think was telling him that she would be a good pick?
Well, I mean, Neera Tandon she has a reputation. She was probably going to be chief of staff for Hillary Clinton if Clinton won in 2016. So she has that experience. She was in the Clinton White House. She definitely has a certain level of experience there. But I think in a weird way, the Biden team thought, okay, I'm going to give progressives a choice by getting the head of the Center for American Progress. I mean, literally, there was a journalist friend of mine who said he talked to the head of a progressive organization today. And that person said that they heard from someone in the Biden transition who said, see, we were listening to you, progressives, we gave you Neera Tanden. So, I mean, there's, you know, the Biden team is not on Twitter, right? They don't know that progressives have a problem. That's that. I mean, I think in a weird way that this was seen as the progressive bone. And what I fear is that when she doesn't get confirmed because she's been antagonistic, and that you know, Republicans and conservatives will have their feelings hurt and they won't vote for her, that it'll be blamed on the fact that she's somehow progressive, right?
Yeah.
And it'll be that, see, progressives can't get confirmed, and so we're going to have to go to the moderates. So that's my fear with it.
Maybe Adam Green from the Bold Progressives liked her, and we progressives don't think he's so bold, seeing as he supported Elizabeth Warren the entire time when Bernie Sanders was running in 2016. He had at the bottom of his signature, you know, the Warren wing of the Democratic Party, even though Bernie was captivating the nation. So I wanted to ask you my penultimate question. I love using that word. And that's about the article that you wrote yesterday on social inequality, which I thought was so excellent. You really gave a great contrast between how the 1%, or actually the 1/100th of 1%, I guess, has fared during this pandemic compared to the vast majority of the people. And you talked about the conditions that led to that, and you spent a good time on monopoly, which is a subject. If you have any influence with Matt Stoller, please try to get him to come on my show. I keep asking him and he never replies, but I think he's been such a great force in talking about anti-monopolization, which you wrote seems to have, you know,
my book right here, Monopolized: Life in the Age of Corporate Power.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I got to interview you on your own book. I'm sorry, that's crazy. I'm going to read that book. You're going to send me a copy, right?
Sure.
Yes. So.
All right. Yeah. So, I mean, I'll talk about the stories. So, you know, I mean, I think historically in crises, you see this widening gap between rich and poor. I mean, we saw it in the financial crisis, certainly. The difference here is that in the pandemic, we have not seen any moment at which the rich had to worry about anything. They have completely hoarded themselves off from the rest of the country. And even in the financial crisis, wealthy people did take a hit and then they got it all back, right? There wasn't even a hit here. Like, we're still in the crisis, and yet, you know, there's really good studies from the Institute for Policy Studies about looking at the 644 billionaires and how they fared since the pandemic hit in March. And it's over $1 trillion that they've gained in wealth just since March. At the same time, as you say, food insecurity is skyrocketing, unemployed in the millions, and you know, it's getting so that the aggregate statistics about unemployment and wages and things like that, they almost don't apply, because you're talking about two different groups of society, right? It's like the old joke where Bill Gates walks into a bar with two other people and instantly raises the average wealth in that bar by millions and millions of dollars. Well, those two people, that didn't help them any. It's just, you know, it's just an average situation. So, you know, we're in a position right now where the democracy is caters to the rich. The economy in frequently caters to the rich. And this has accelerated in the crisis, such that we're at a wider point between the rich and poor than at any time. I even think wider than before the Depression. And the task of the next 4 years is the same task that we should have been working on for the last 40 years, which is how to harness this organized money and bring it back to earth.
Now, you came up with some policies at the end that you said that Joe Biden could implement even without Senate approval. Can you discuss some of those policies, and based on this economic team that we've talked about tonight, how likely he and this team are to go for your suggestions?
Well, we talked about some of them a little bit earlier, and that was regarding the IRS, for example. So tax policy can be made more progressive simply by reinterpreting the rules that are already on the books. And also putting audit capabilities towards the rich rather than the poor. There's this amazing stat in the Trump era where the richest 23,000 people in the country, only 7 of them were audited in 2018, which is an absolutely stunning stat.
Well, the reason for that was, there was a reason for that. They said that the expertise they needed to audit the rich, they don't have because Trump decimated the IRS budget.
Right, and they say that auditing the poor is easier, and so they do it a lot more. Yeah. And so you have this complete inversion there, and so part of it is about budgets, but part of it is also about focus. And I do think that there's room to at least do more than 7 audits of the top 23,000. So that's one thing. Another thing is reinterpreting the laws that have been passed in the tax code. There's obviously things you can do on wages, which is sort of pre-distribution of income. Taxes are after the distribution of income, but you can certainly do some things on wages. The U.S. government is the biggest employer in terms of federal contractors in the country. And about 1/4 of all large corporations are federal contractors, the US government. And you could put in a high road contracting law that, and this is just a rule that the president can make by executive order, and he can say, anyone who wants to be a contractor to the federal government has to pay their workers a $15 an hour minimum wage. And you can do that and also give them sick leave and allow them to join a union and all of those things. So that's another way where you can tackle sort of the pre-distribution of income. And then there's all things around corporate power and concentration, which inevitably rolls back on wages and compensation and inequality. Obviously we've, for the last 40 years, completely walked off the field in terms of merger policy and antitrust law, and the laws are on the books. It's a matter of will and a matter of enforcement. And if you start reinforcing those things and weaken the power of the behemoths, the corporate giants, you can make a situation that's more equitable for labor.
Well,
so
do you think that Janet Yellen is going to continue what Barr is doing with no, Barr is
the Attorney General. We don't know who the Attorney General is going to be yet.
Okay, never mind that.
So that's a really interesting thing to think about. We're not quite sure who's going to be in that position. I've heard Doug Jones, the former Alabama senator, which would be an interesting choice. He prosecuted the Birmingham church bombing. He actually endorsed the Bernie Sanders model in the pandemic of supporting wages through payroll support. He jumped on that bill. So, I mean, he's kind of an interesting guy.
You know who I would love to see, although he'll never get it because he disgraced himself? I think Eliot Spitzer would be an amazing Attorney General. Or even Schneiderman, but then Schneiderman had the same issue as Spitzer, right? Didn't he have
about New York Attorney Generals? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. All right, my final question, because you just wrote this article today, and it doesn't really relate to his economic team, but there's some overlap, and that's Gina Raimondo, who's the governor of Rhode Island, purported pick to head Health and Human Services. You wrote an article about her as to what is highly problematic. So why don't you say the 3 main things that you pointed out in that article?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, healthcare is 1/6 of the economy, right? So it's certainly an economic position. It's a huge economic position.
Right. Yeah, I'm thinking.
And has been a huge driver within the Democratic Party in terms of healthcare policy. So Raimondo is a centrist. She's moderate. She was thought to be possibly in the running for vice president. She was in the running for Treasury secretary. And now she's seen as the leading contender for HHS. But that's really interesting and maybe untenable, because she has a mixed record on reproductive rights, which, the Democratic Party has really rallied around reproductive rights, and in a way that, over the last decade, they've really, you have to be pretty strong on choice in order to get a top position in the Democratic Party. And Raimondo, when she was governor, her first budget in 2015 basically took away abortion coverage from thousands of families in Rhode Island. She mandated that every insurance company that was selling policies on the exchanges, the Obamacare exchanges, had to also sell a policy that excluded abortion coverage from it. And the way that it worked is that if you had coverage in the prior year, you were automatically re-enrolled in a comparable policy the next year. So 9,000 families got re-enrolled in a policy that didn't have abortion coverage, and they didn't even know it. So the only way they would know it is if they went to get an abortion, they gave their insurance, and then they would be told, well, you actually don't have coverage for this under your policy. Because of that, NARAL, Pro-Choice America, which is the largest and most prominent abortion rights group, gave her a mixed rating. They say that Rhode Island is restrictive on abortion access. It has the same rating as Wyoming, even though it's a big blue state in the Northeast. She, in 2018, when she ran for re-election, a group of abortion rights advocates like Gloria Steinem and the former head of NARAL, Kate Michelman, wrote a letter against her, saying that she was extremely harmful to the rights of women in their reproductive health. So I don't see how you can have that record and become HHS secretary. It just does not compute in today's Democratic Party. So,
talk about her role with the United Health Infrastructure Project with Deloitte.
Yeah, exactly. So, this is another thing where, she's supposed to be this technocrat that is wise and figures things out, but she set up this system they were supposed to streamline eligibility for things like Medicaid and food stamps and things like that. And it just didn't work. It was a computer system, and it kept randomly throwing people off benefits or delaying them, doing all these terrible things. Deloitte Consulting was the consultant on the project. They botched it up tremendously. And instead of firing them, she extended their contract. She took discounts from the money that she was paying them, but continued to pay them future payments to manage this broken system. HHS is a pretty technocratic job. You're running Medicare, you're running Medicaid, and that shows really poor judgment that you weren't able to put this benefit program together in Rhode Island, which is not a big state, right? It's not like a huge program.
Well, I've got some information from my fellow 2016 Bernie delegate, Lauren Needell, my fellow Lauren. She said that in 2014, she decimated the pensions of teachers when she was a treasurer. She's pretty much hated by unions, and she was pushing for a fracked gas power plant in the rural part of the state in 2015.
Yeah.
So hopefully,
I wrote about the union thing when she was up for Treasury Secretary. We broke that story, and we wrote pretty extensively about the union thing. I felt like because this was HHS, I wanted to focus on other things, but yeah, absolutely a problem.
Well, we've reached the end of our time. I told you we were only going to go a half hour, and we've gone even longer than my usual 45 minutes. So I want to thank you for sticking with me. And I wanted to let my viewers know that next week I'm going to be talking about Biden's environmental appointees with Steve Horn, who is the climate reporter for the Real News Network, and Michael Swifty, who writes for The Wrong Kind of Green. So thank you very much again, David, for being on. Thank you, viewers.
Thank you.
Thank you, viewers, for watching. And I want everybody to stay safe, stay home, wear your mask, and keep fighting.